Hello YouTube, I love making segments about hearing how people would build professional cars and beat nuts. Bunch of cars in the background because we're doing a bonus day right now. It's Drift Week 2's over. People are still here, people are still driving, and I love asking people how they would build a professional car because it's talking about how much they would spend, what parts they would choose, how they would do it looking into the future. And he is from Europe, from Amsterdam in particular, and he would have a very different mindset of how he would probably build a car coming into America because the logistics of traveling, the logistics of everything, he's not doing Formula D, by the way. It's just talking about it because he does professional drifting overseas, and just like what would he bring over to try and beat all the Americans? Go.
That's a good question.
Introduce yourself too.
My name is Wout Jong, I'm from the Netherlands.
What's your shop name too?
My shop name is Einzel, it's written right over here.
Okay.
It's like a German word for one of a kind. So when we choose that name, I didn't want like an abbreviation like ABC Racing or whatever. I wanted like a German sounding, like it's a German company from the 70s, you know. So that's why we choose that. Yeah, so that's it. And people call me Drift Jesus, so that's like all my social media is Drift Jesus. Follow Drift Jesus is my Instagram. With regards to your question, what I would build for America, obviously you need a lot of power, and I am a V8 guy. I love V8s. So I do two things in life. I build race cars, drift cars. We produce drift parts. And I have another shop that does BMW and Porsche maintenance, crash repair, and all that stuff. So that's like road cars. And that has a lot to do with how I would answer that question, because in the workshop we see a lot of problems with cars that are very complicated, direct injection, turbos, 8-speed automatics, all kinds of things like super exotic aluminum or titanium engine alloys, and I see that day in, day out, and the problems that happen with that. So that's why my pro car back in Europe is a very simple car. Yeah, so that's what I would build for if I would build an American car. I would do exactly the same thing as I did in Europe. Yeah, so that's it.
You just do the exact same thing? You want to explain what it is?
Yeah, so I'm a BMW guy. I also love Nissan's S chassis. I have a lot of love for them. I think that's a fantastic car, but they are a little bit harder to find where I'm from, and they're all right to drive because they typically come from the United Kingdom, and the United Kingdom people got them from Japan. So they're usually cars that have had quite a tough life already. England is a fantastic country, but they have a very long tradition of parking their cars on their wet lawns for years, which is not a fantastic idea in a country that has 300 days of rain. So most of those cars that you get from the UK have a lot of corrosion, and I've been building race cars now for almost 20 years, and I don't feel like spending 2-3 weeks cutting up a chassis, welding patches in it and whatever just for rust before I can start building it. BMWs are a lot easier to get. You can almost get them for free, like a chassis, an E46 or an E36 chassis with nothing in it, which is fine because we replace everything on that car anyways. You can pick it up everywhere, like any breaker's yard is super happy if you come around and grab it. And also like windscreen of an S chassis, where I live, it's like 400 or 500 euros, and you need to go get it like 1,000 kilometers down the road. And a BMW windscreen is whatever, 10 bucks or I don't know. And you do break like 1 or 2 windscreens a year, so like that's one of my things. Like you always need a very small amount of original parts, like the rear, the main arms in the rear, BMW cast piece, the hubs. You need that, you know, and that's increasingly difficult to get in Europe. So that's one of the reasons I choose BMW, and the other one is that the E46 is a very strong chassis because from the factory it came with a very big diesel engine like M57, which is a massive heavy like 350-pound diesel. So that whole car, the way it's made, the chassis rails are made, and how the body is made, the thickness of the steel, that's a little bit bigger than on the S chassis, which is developed for smaller wheels, 4-cylinder engines, and that's basically built more like a sports car. And the BMW 3 Series is like a family car, so you can tell that it's a little bit more beefy, but on the other end it's the same weight. So one of my best friends, Lars, has an S13 with a V8 in it, with Wisefab, with everything on it, and that car is 1,146 kilos, and my E46 is 1,090, and he still has the original rear end. So I think the S chassis, like an S13 and an E46, if you build them exactly the same way with like Kevlar body parts and tube frame and blah blah blah, same cage, they would weigh about the same. So there's actually no real drawbacks except that it's not I think a BMW is regarded as less drifty than an S chassis, because that's like the car that it all started from, and that everybody, like, if you see an S chassis, you immediately make a link with drifting, and BMW is more like circuit racing. So yeah, but that's one of the reasons. And my car has a Chevrolet V8. It's actually not an actual Chevrolet, it's a company that makes Chevrolet small blocks. It costs their own ones. So there's a couple differences. A couple parts of the block are beefier. The oiling is different. It's priority main oiling, as it's called. The camshaft sits a little bit higher in the block to accommodate a bigger crank, and it's a 404. So we just got another engine for the car that's gonna go.
You said small block. Does that mean it's an LS or an old small block?
No, it's difficult to, because an LS is technically a small block, because it's like the engine that they made after the small block. So the small block that's made from 1955 right up until 1998, which was in all the passenger cars like Corvettes, Camaros, whatever. That's what I would call a small block, because it has a little different ignition sequence. So an LS starts with 187 ignition and a small block starts with 184, and that's why it also sounds different. And I love how LS's sound, don't get me wrong, but I think a small block sounds just 10% better. It has that like Smokey and the Bandit sound, you know, that you know as a kid from the American movies, and it has a little bit more aggressive, like visceral sound. LS is fantastic, but it has like a little less tamer, a little tamer sound. And I'm a big fan of iron blocks, and the reason for that is simple. Temperature. So an aluminum block, like if you take aluminum, the heat transfers through that much easier. So that's why people never make aluminum exhausts, because if you would make an aluminum exhaust, your floor would be insanely hot after 10 minutes, because all the heat passes through. And iron retains heat much better. Stainless steel retains heat real well. That's why stainless steel is a good material for exhaust and stuff like that. So when the guys that built my engine back home built it, it was one of the first small blocks, I think, ever built for drifting.
Before you get too off, could you explain to me why you would want the heat to be trapped inside of a motor? Is it because you want the coolant to do its job in the radiator?
Well, it just
because wouldn't it be good to dissipate all the heat through the block?
And because that heat is always going to be there, so it just means that you heat up everything else around it. So the moving parts in the block will always generate heat, no matter if it's an SR or an LS or a small block. But if it retains that heat, it means that you're not heating up everything else, so you're not heating up your intake as much, and like your coolant doesn't have to do so much work. And that was like one of my main things, because that's what we see with the turbo blocks as well. We built BMW M50s, that's like the straight line 6 BMW, and they work very well on turbo because it's a cast iron block, and you can really tell that the temperatures are quite a lot lower compared to if you use the 2.8, which is an aluminum block. So I like that, and the guys that built this motor for me, when I came to them, I said, like, where should I mount like the oil cooler and stuff like that, and they said, no, we don't run them with an oil cooler, you don't have to. I said, well, I need to, you know, that I'm going to be in the rev limiter, it's going to have not a lot of head-on wind, so it's going to run hot. And the guy said, just try it without the oil cooler, you know, trust me. And that guy has been building small blocks and big blocks for whatever, like ages, like 30 years, for speedway use and all kinds of things that we also have in Europe. And I took his word, and we didn't run an oil cooler, and the temperature of that car, like, it's been built in 2017, and it's like spot on, like it never overheats. So it doesn't even have an oil cooler on.
Do you run an oil temp sensor?
Yeah.
And you just, what does the oil temp get to?
It's around 220.
And it's because it's dissipating all the heat through the radiator?
It's because
or like, the oil just doesn't get hot?
Yeah, so what happens is that when engines heat up, like, it's an upward spiral. So it's like, in a way, like, once it spirals out of control, it's very hard to get it back down. So in iron block, it just doesn't run that hot. So you don't have to spend a lot of effort cooling it down. And an oil cooler is a smaller orifice, so it means that an oil cooler will cool maybe 10 or 20 degrees, but it will also gain 5 or 6 degrees because you're pushing it through small orifices. So there's like, same with the supercharger. So a 400 horsepower supercharger will eat up 200 horsepower. So you'll end up with a net result of 200 horsepower more. And it's the same with an oil cooler. An oil cooler will cool down like a certain amount of the temperature, but you'll also gain a little bit of temperature because you're pushing it through those little channels. So it has a capacity to cool 30 degrees, but you'll also gain 6 degrees. So it means that you're netting a 24 degree lower temperature with that thing. So if you are able to...
So you're saying the friction of the oil going through the actual cooler itself is heating up the oil?
Yeah, that heats up the oil.
I never would think about that.
Yeah, well, those guys that build those engines for so long, and that's the thing with the small block, like that engine has been in production for 55 years, and I can guarantee you that if you build an engine 55 years ago, that 54 years and 11 months ago they started racing that engine, because that's what people do. So the small block has been not changed for so long that there are so many shops that know about them and have like 40, 50 cars driving on drag strips, on speedways, on ovals every weekend. So all that knowledge combined, which is mostly in America, but it's also everywhere else in the world, because they made 100 million of those engines. So any camshaft, any head, any clutch, anything that's ever produced by any company, they'll make it for a small block because that's the biggest market. And there are so many people working with that engine that they will eventually, like, they will know like what to do, you know. And if you tap into that, yeah, then that can be an advantage to you. So the guy that built my engine, like, he knows nothing about any other engines, but he knows absolutely everything there is to know about these engines. And they have like this real world experience, because he builds so many of those engines and they run every weekend and they run them hard. So that's like, I don't have to reinvent the wheel, just listen to that guy. You know?
That's really good, not reinventing the wheel and just like leveraging someone that has all the experience. You can just buy an engine package from an engine builder and he knows what he's doing. You don't have to reinvent the wheel, you don't have to go into that. You can spend your time doing other things. Especially because like most people won't be on the same engine forever. So what is the purpose of learning? Like everything I learned about an SR, I wish I didn't know now.
No, but that's
I wish I didn't learn the lessons through the money spent. I wish I didn't know anything about rocker arms. I wish I didn't know anything about them blowing up. Wish I didn't know, just like scrub my brain of that. I don't want SRs anymore.
But that's the thing, like what I like about American V8s is it's also a platform that you can keep expanding. So you can basically get a 4,000 euro crate engine, LS, and you can get like a $32,000 shop built LS, and it will fit with the same motor mounts. It may even fit the same headers. So you can like keep growing without rebuilding the whole car, which is for me also a very big thing. So if I would build my car for a 2JZ, which is a fantastic engine which I love, and I would come to the conclusion that it's not the engine I want to run and I want to go to an LS, then that's obviously means going back to scratch, going back to square one. So I also wanted to use a platform that's very scalable, and Chevy small block or any American V8 can be Ford. That is very scalable because this country is so big and there's so many shops making stuff for it, and they keep like the cylinder heads. At one point American V8 cylinder heads, like they couldn't push more air to it, and then they started working with the valve angles. So they changed the angles of the valve and boom, there you go, immediately they went even faster and they made even more power. So it's mind-blowing to think that an engine platform that's so old still has, like, every 5 to 10 years people invent something that make that engine do even more. And in essence it's a very good engine because it has a very low center of gravity, and that's one of the things that is of paramount importance to me, that my car has a very low center of gravity, because everything on that car, every aspect of that car improves so much from that. And I think it's one of the things that drifters don't really look at, but that's, for me, that stands out before almost anything else. Like, have that center of gravity as low as you can get it.
So do you run a carburetor still?
Yeah, I run a carburetor, yeah. So the funny thing
Explain why you run a carburetor.
When I built that
You've got to be the only person I know in drifting that runs a carburetor.
Since I built that car, there are 2 or 3 guys that now run a carburetor. There's this crazy NASCAR engine now in DMAC, owned by Yannick Rasmussen, which is a friend and a client of mine. He got that Dodge NASCAR engine, the 357. And he runs a carburetor now too, because in essence there's nothing wrong with a carburetor. It's just that people are used to shitty carburetors, and a shitty carburetor is not going to work just as much as a shitty map on your engine injection. Are we?
Yeah, keep going.
Keep going.
We just listen to V8's rev in the background. It's probably a small block.
It's probably small. No, it's
with a crappy fuel injection system.
So, well, I don't want to say that's crappy, but like I said, I work day in day out with road cars that are very, very complicated. The BMWs, they sense like knob control through the ignition coils and stuff like that. Like, it's super, super, super advanced. And my own personal car that I built from the ground up, like that car is over 2,500 hours spent on it. That's as simple as it can be, and we spend a lot of time making it simple.
So this car is so simple and is built with a carbureted V8 and all these simplistic parts, like, you know, a chassis that you can get for $100 and a $10 windshield and all these things. So it's probably like a $10,000 car.
No, it's not a $10,000 car.
No.
But like, if I look at my labor, like 2,500 hours tell me what I should charge per hour. If it's $10, it's still.
Well, if you're working on a $100 car, it should probably be pretty cheap.
Well, that's a chassis,
Yeah.
But like, it's a lot of work to make a car simple. So if I build a car, I always regard to how easily can I take it apart. Like I've seen some.
Before you get off, because you'll keep talking. Tell me about the carburetor now. So you run a carburetor. Is it turbo or naturally
aspirated?
aspirated?
No, it's NA.
NA, nitrous or anything?
No, nothing.
And how much power does it make?
It's 580 wheel.
And that's a full-on pro car in Europe?
Yeah, that's full-on pro car. Yeah, and there's guys, I've done battle with guys that have 1,000 horsepower turbo engine, and well, to be honest, they were not faster. In Germany, I did a tandem with a guy, and he had like 200 horsepower more, but he was like 5 car lengths behind. Because you need to regard at how many or how big the power band of the engine is, and my engine is over 400 pound-feet from 1,500 RPM. So it just immediately does that. That's why you break shafts and diffs and boxes with that engine, because the car is doing 5 miles an hour and it gets all that torque. And there's guys that may have 800 horsepower, 900, but it only comes into play when the car is doing 30, 40, 50 miles an hour. And all that time, you're gaining on them, and they need to make that back up. I have a turbo car too. My backup car is a turbo car, which is
turbo carbureted V8.
No, that's a BMW M50. It's
carbureted turbo.
No,
inline six.
No, it's just a standard. Like, I have one carbureted car, and when I built that car, everybody said, "You're crazy, don't do it. It's not gonna have a throttle response. It's gonna use way too much fuel. You'll need an old guy with you all the time to adjust it when it's warm or when it's cold." And I generally don't listen to other people anymore. I stopped doing that a very, very long time ago. And I just built that car the way I wanted it, with a small block, without an oil cooler, with a carburetor, with a NASCAR G-force 4-speed gearbox, with a quick change. And I couldn't be happier with that car. When we were finished with that car and we put it on the scales and we checked out the balance and everything, when I drove it for the first time, I was over the moon with how easy the car is to drive and how much more potential it has. And the thing with carburetors is that it works on vacuum, so the engine is basically an air pump which sucks through the carburetor. So if the setup in the carburetor is correct, you cannot get a more direct fuel delivery than that. Because what an injection system does, it's basically the engine tells the computer what it wants, and then the computer fires up the injectors to do that, which is totally fine. It happens in like a 100th of a second. But if you jet a carburetor perfectly well, it will also do that. A guy in Tennessee said that my carburetor, it's like, I drove that car and it's like almost too touchy on the throttle. Like, it has such an incredible throttle response. And then after the first event, we thought like, oh, it's probably going to be consuming a lot of fuel because it's a carburetor, blah blah. And it actually consumes about the same as all the other pro cars that I was running against. So my buddy Lars has an LS3. That's a built engine. That's a very good car, and then he uses the exact same amount of fuel as I do in the exact same event. So in that aspect, it doesn't like have any drawbacks, and there's not a single sensor on that car that it needs to run. So
that's the best part. That's not having anything telling your car it shouldn't run, because most of the time the sensors, all the extra things, all the wires, that's what's breaking the car. Like, the engine is always fine. I mean, not all the time, but the engine's always fine. And there's a temperature readout and you decide whether or not to turn it off or not. But other than that, like, it's just all the extra stuff on the motor braking. So how much does that engine package cost if I wanted, say you convince me now, I am going to go get a carbureted engine?
Well, I think that a built engine, like with forged internals and everything, and a good pair of cylinder heads, I think that's always going to cost you about 20K. I mean, there's no other way around that. But that's still, like, if you really do the maths on a turbo engine, that's going to be more expensive, because people forget to factor in all the nickel and dime stuff. Like, I build a lot of cars. You know, there's a big difference between what people say on Instagram or on Facebook or even face to face to the invoices that I see. Like, it's always funny if people sell a car and they ask like 30 grand for it, and they're, those are people that have been telling me for years how cheap their engine is and that it's stock block and blah blah blah, 1,000 horsepower, no problem, blah blah blah. And then they sell the car and then they show all the invoices with it, and that's a little different story.
Yeah.
Because with the thing with a V8, if you buy a built V8, if you go to Texas Speed, you go to Moss Motorsport, you go to a shop that did my engine, you need to pay it. You say like, here, that's the engine I want. This is what it costs. Here you go. There's your crate. That's there. Swipe your card. You have it. Most turbo builds are not like that. I would almost call it, without trying to be arrogant or without like insulting people, I would almost call it a way of drift financing. So people buy a standard JZ block for $2,000, like a full standard thing, like a GE or whatever. And then like, okay, that's $2,000. And then a month later, they're gonna buy an exhaust manifold for $1,500, and then a turbo for $3,000, and then this, and then this. So that $20,000 that you spend on a built V8, it comes in little steps. And people have that moment of joy, like, oh God, I got my new exhaust manifold. Yeah, you know, post a picture, I'm so happy. Like they feed their inner child with that purchase of $1,500 or euros. And then they need injectors, and then they need a fuel rail, and then they have it all together. Because you need like air people, you need head gaskets, you need all that nickel and dime stuff, which is really killing. On a JZ is a fantastic engine, but a lot of people have like alternator failures. Duarte had an alternator failure on his car. We've seen that many times. The water pumps fail, the power steering pumps fail. It's a fantastic engine layout, but the stuff that's bolted on it is typically not fantastic. If you take a look at Red Dan, the FD driver, he develops a lot of stuff around the JZ to make sure that you don't have to use JZ ancillaries, because A, they're very expensive, because it's becoming like a classic car, and B, they're not very good, simple as that. So if you are looking at that, like I think Dylan Hughes went from a V8 to a JZ, and he stated that that had something to do with money. He said like it's cheaper to get that certain amount of power with that JZ engine, but the cylinder head that he runs is $6,000. The turbo that he runs is $5,000. That's just the cylinder head and the turbo. That's $11,000.
Mm-hmm.
That's it. Then you got nothing. You got no short block. You got no crank. You got no rods. You got no injectors. You got no ECU. You got no wiring harness. You have nothing. And that's one of those things. Like if you add that up, that engine is going to be way more expensive than the $22,000 Moss Motorsports 600 horsepower V8, and he may have 900 horsepower out of that car, according to which dyno it goes on, because that was like a real funny thing when he put it on Forsberg's. The dyno that Forsberg ran on, it gained like 200 horsepower. But those guys, like, I'm not saying that they are like trying to overstate the horsepower of the car, but it was a funny thing that when they finished that E46 and they went on one dyno, it made like 700, and then went on the next dyno and it made 900. And that's also something that you need to keep in mind, that the horsepower figures that people throw around, to me it doesn't always translate to how fast that car goes on the track. Like I've tandemed with guys that had 450 wheel that were very, very, very fast, and I've tandemed with guys that have 1,000 horsepower, and I'm like, yeah, I'm not seeing where that's going. And if you see a car like Chelsea the Nova's car, which is an NA car with a lot of nitrous, the RTR Mustang, that is proper fast, you know, because you see how that car moves. And this car too, Ben Hobson's car, if you see this car move, like we saw it move at the Freedom Factory a couple days ago, you know it's fast, you know it's gripping up, you know.
Is your car faster than this?
I don't know, I wouldn't know. Like this has more power than mine for sure. Like I wouldn't know. Like I think my chassis is pretty fast, so the E46 has a lot of side bite, and I like to run a car smoothly. So I'm not the kind of guy that's very jerky and clutch kicky with a car. Like I like more of a smooth style. And Ben is very, very rowdy. He's very like how do you say that? Like aggressive and stuff. So I wouldn't know. I'd have to battle him to find out.
That would be too difficult.
I think so, but I think my engine, like I can also run more ignition on that. There's some more power left in that engine, but I run it on pump fuel, and we don't run like the full ignition timing. So we could run a couple more degrees, but that will mean that you rebuild that engine more often. And yeah, so we could go to a higher CR if we went with race fuel or whatever. But in Europe, it's not so easy to transport race fuel because it's actually illegal. So you need to be sponsored or whatever and have like the racing fuel company drop off the fuel at the racetrack. Right now, the competitions that I do are not like very suitable for that. So I tend to keep everything on pump fuel. We have pretty good pump fuel in Europe. Like it's 100 octane European octane, so I think that would be 95, 96.
That's good fuel.
That's very good fuel. Yeah.
All right, so you talk so well, you keep going into the weeds a little bit. We were talking about your Formula D build.
Yeah.
What would you do differently than, say, the Americans? What would you... We don't have to cover the entire car, because a lot of it's just dog box, quick change at this point.
That's very simple.
Is there anything you would do specifically?
Well,
and
like
you're going to say
chassis...
WiseFab 10 times.
No, I'm not going to say WiseFab 10 times. Why would I say WiseFab 10 times?
Because you
didn't I say WiseFab enough?
I'm just joking.
Just do it. Are you bothered by me saying WiseFab?
No, not at all. You just love it so much.
What? WiseFab?
He's sponsored.
The word WiseFab. Or like the company.
No, I'm just joking.
No, I won't say WiseFab anymore. No more WiseFab.
No, you absolutely can.
Okay.
He's sponsored by WiseFab.
By who?
Yeah.
Okay. Anyway, so what I said also in the other video, which I love the replies to the video we did in the beginning of Trivia. I'm very grateful that people liked it and didn't fall asleep. But like the chassis rules are different, so we always connect stuff to the strut towers and all this stuff. That's not allowed in FD. So my Pro car would not be eligible for FD because of that.
Does that make a big difference, by the way, in performance?
Yeah, and I understand where FD is coming from by not allowing that, but it would bring the cost down a lot. Because you could run a chassis way longer. We talked about it in the other video, like Wordhouse did like 2 seasons with their S15. I think that if they would have been able to build it in a European way, that it may have seen more seasons.
And how does the chassis specifically fail? Because it doesn't have the strut towers connected to the firewall
exactly.
stuff?
So you you just feel it with the car. Like I've had cars that we ran on the Nürburgring on the racetrack, which is a very demanding track, and at one point like it was a sedan car, BMW, and at one point like the rear doors won't open, or when you open them they're like pop when they don't close, like the whole chassis like flexes.
Like my car.
Well, it's normal because like I said, they're made for 15-inch wheels, and you have like 18 huge 18s on it. And I just took a few laps with you. You drive aggressively, you do the transitions on the clutch, like that's obviously for us that's all normal, but when those people made that car in 1993, it was never...
Can you take a worn out car and then add those... I'm just asking for myself at this point. Can you take out my super worn out car and then just connect the cage up to the strut towers and save it?
It would help, but I think it would, like, I always start with a very fresh chassis. So.
I don't. I start with
well, like you can do that, and it's better than not running it. But the best way, of course, like if you start with the absolute best way is start with like a granny-owned S14, which is obviously impossible to find. But if you would, that would be better, and then connect that and stitch weld it. Because I believe in FD guys do stitch weld the car, and on the S chassis you really need to do that. Not knocking the S chassis. Like I love that car, but it's totally normal that what we do. Amount of power that we push through them, the grip that we have now with the tires and the shocks, that is totally normal that those cars, you know, have some problems with cracks and whatever. And I understand that FD doesn't, I mean, there needs to be a certain threshold, otherwise they become sort of semi-kit cars, and you gain a lot of performance from the roll cage, and FD simply is about that the cage is for safety and not for improving the chassis. And in Europe, they are always looking at the FIA rules, so the international rules for motorsports, like that they run at Le Mans. And if you have that cage in your car, then they're fine, and you can connect whatever you want, as long as that cage is there present. And it's a more elaborate cage than the American FD cages, because you need to have a double A pillar, you need to have like a bar in the roof, like over here you see a lot of cars that have like an open space above your head. It's a little bit scary to me. So I think there's about 4 or 5 yards more tubing in a European car than there is in an American car. So if I would have to build an FD car, I would still build an FIA style cage, because that's allowed in FD. But I wouldn't connect it to the strut towers and to the rear pickup points and whatever. And other than that, I think I would talk to local drivers, like a guy like Chelsea, who has been around so much and is a chassis guru, and ask him like what spring rates and what kind of stuff, because like I said in the other interview, the tracks here are very different. I think if you copy paste the pro car of the guys that win everything in Europe, and if Dwayne McKeever's car would be copy pasted to America, I'm not sure if it would work, because the setups are a little different. I know
James Dean's worked really well.
It's not the same car.
Yeah.
So I'm sure that they had wonderful people on board at Wordhouse, also Americans. So I'm pretty sure that those people have like that experience, like how this car has to be built. James' car was built in Ireland, built this car was built in Poland. The first seasons they ran with field suspension, so I'm sure that Audi, Audi knows that Audi is also one of those guys that knows exactly what a car should do and should not do. So they tap into that. I think it's mostly like shocks, alignment. I know that a lot of FD guys run rear ARBs because they run such soft springs, and like I think HGK didn't run an ARB on their cars in Europe.
ARB? Oh, like a sway bar?
Sorry, a rear sway bar.
Okay.
Anti-roll bar, sorry. And they added, like they made an anti-roll bar to the E46 car that they had, like the red and white E46. Because of they had to go to such low spring rates that the car was like basically starting to dance a little bit. And in Europe, they tend to run a little higher spring rate, so you could do without the ARB. So that's a couple of differences. Yeah, and apart from that, I would still run a V8. I think the racing fuel stuff here is a little
carbureted V8 that 404, or would you do something bigger?
The biggest you can get.
How big?
I don't know, the biggest that could do
like
reps.
a 502?
I would want that thing to do 8,500 RPM. I think that's because then you have a lot of reach. Also when you're in a battle against a slower car, so you can stick it like in a lower gear and keep going. The V8 has a lot of reach because it starts very low, like you basically could like drift it from 2,500 RPM. So if you have 8,500 RPM to play with, you got 6K RPM to be in.
You could choose to do a big block if you went aluminum.
You could.
And the weight wouldn't be any crazier.
You could do that, but I would prefer a cast iron block. That's my thing.
That'd be too heavy then.
For a big block. Yeah, but like the big blocks, like if you look at the bore and stroke and all this stuff and the weight of the rotating assembly, they don't like revs that much. For drag racing, it's totally fine, but that's a whole different story. For drifting, yeah, I think that a 454 or something like that, maybe even bigger.
Can you do that on a small block?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, we have a client that runs a very, very big engine in a road racing car. That's yeah. At one point you're grinding out of the block, and you can't use a standard small block, so you need to go to a shop like Dart or World Products or those shops that build specific engines for racing applications, and they will, like I said, they will raise the crank a little bit, so you can, or the cam a little bit, so the cam is positioned higher in the block, so you can run a bigger crank. And all those tricks exist for so many years. There's so many companies in America that make these engines, and I would like that. That's just my kind of thing. And I think that I need more horsepower for FD, so you need to go to maybe 700 wheel with a V8 engine. So, but I think on race gas and with a little bit more displacement, yeah, with race gas you can run more ignition and you can run a higher compression ratio. So I think that should be possible. And of course the dog box, but that's like the whole thing behind the engine is becoming copy paste because you run like either a G-force dog box or whatever, and everybody knows how to make a prop shaft, or how you call it in America, like
drive shaft.
Drive shaft. Well, the drive shafts to me are the ones
Axles?
that go to the wheels. Yeah.
Yeah, whatever.
Whatever.
We
so
get it.
Anyways,
Something that
we
is
say
a
prop
tube.
shaft. Yeah, the tube thing from the gearbox to the diff.
Drive shaft.
Yeah. So you just get all that's like copy paste. You can buy that. Like it's proven. Everybody knows what to do. Everybody knows the gear ratios. If you have the quick change, you can like swap them out or whatever. So that's not that difficult. And yeah, I love the E46 chassis. I also love the E92 chassis. I would love an S15. I still think the E46 is one of the best and most underrated chassis. Like if Chelsea De Nova would build an E46.
He did.
Yeah, but
again,
if he would build a new E46 and he would put the motor out of that RTR muscle there, forget about it. Yeah.
He did a nitrous LS in his for a short period of time.
Yeah, I know.
Cool. All right. Well, I think we should probably end.
Yeah.
Is there anything else you want to talk about? I don't want to cut you off completely.
No,
but I think
but
somebody has to.
You should. Yeah. No, I just love being here and I love meeting all you guys and talking.
Cool.
And I'm a little sad that Drift Week is over.
I know.
Actually, physically sad. Like, yeah, how can you be otherwise?
You're going on a chemical low now. You had so many serotonins and dopamines floating around in your body, and adrenaline from almost wrecking your car constantly. All the friends are leaving, and you're like, oh.
And it's so nice to. America's has been a warm bath to me. Not only the drivers, but also everybody, like random people at gas stations and guys that we met all across America, like the states that we've done. For me, it's like not only the drifting, but traveling through America, meeting Americans, going to like sites. Like we've been to some fantastic spots. For me, that's like really, really good. And returning to Europe right now with the situation Europe is in right now, it's going to be like more of a black and white movie. Yeah. So I'm not very much looking forward.
I have something to talk about real quickly for the people that have stuck around.
The one or two people.
America. Well, no, I was going to say in America, like you're European and you were looking at America. in America looks like it's on fire right now with riots and you know all this stuff. Looks like they're having protests everywhere. Looks like everyone's dying with COVID. Looks like a giant disaster. If a European was like, hey, what did America look like? What would you say? Did it look like a mess?
Well, it's funny, we spoke about this on the phone when I spoke to you for the first time, and I asked you, like, what about, you know, the riots and stuff, because on paper, for me, it was really weird going to America during this pandemic, riots, most controversial presidential election ever, driving a car without being a citizen, a drift car through all these states. Like, on paper, it looks like a real dumb idea. But in practice, I have to say that nothing of that applied.
All that was invisible. It was like we just did Drift Week. There was no controversy anywhere, nothing.
And I've been to America many times before, and I really love it. And it's so nice that people are, they are not even bothered by all these things that are in the national news, you know, that doesn't dictate their life. The country where I'm from is very small. It's the same size as the greater LA area. So the national news applies to everybody because it's so small. But in America, people, it seems to me that they live more local. They live like in their city or the greater area or their state, and that's what concerns them. And for me, that's obviously nice. There may be some things going on in America. There are obviously the riots and all that stuff. It's bad, and I hope it ends and it never comes back. But we didn't encounter anything like that. We didn't encounter any aggression or negativity or COVID stuff. Obviously, in some states that we've been to, you have to wear a mask. But yeah, you know, here in Florida, it's like it's 2019. There's no sign of COVID whatsoever. Maybe it's different on the West Coast. I haven't been to the West Coast on this trip or whatever.
It is a lot different over there. They're a lot more strict and stuff. But I was gonna say it has been super relaxed, super stressless.
Very much, yeah.
We didn't. It was actually so stressless because we didn't get to watch the news because we were so busy.
We didn't watch anything.
None of us even knew how the election was going. Every once in a while, like at the end of a day, someone would look and like, oh, still no one decided, and that was that. Like
but
no one was even
cares, and that's what I love. Like
no one cares.
In the European news, they make it out like that Americans are, oh man, that it controls their life, you know, but it doesn't. Like all these guys, all these people I've met, which must have been hundreds of people on this trip, they honestly do not care. They do not care. They care about what concerns them. They're concerned about their family, their friends, and doing whatever they do. And anything else that comes from Washington or whatever, they'll deal with it, you know. Americans have that, what I experienced, that state of mind that says like, just let me know what you want, you know, come to me with whatever the fuck idea you want and we'll handle it and we'll take care of it. And I think that that's a very, very big contrast with how the news in Europe paints America to be right now. And I have to say I'm very assured with that because this is the America that I remember from like the 6 years ago that I was here, and I'm assured that it didn't change because judging from the news that I get, it would have been an entirely different country than the last time that I was here, but it's not. So any Europeans that would like to come to America, come. It's fantastic. The states where we went, Texas is my spirit animal. I love Texas. Like
it's where I'm from.
Man, it's fantastic. Like that's like I should have been born in Texas. That's what I feel. But also here, Florida is fantastic. Alabama, Ken, the track owner, I spoke 2 hours with Ken, the owner of Midpond. Fantastic guy. You know,
oh my God! If you two started talking, I don't think
we did.
Y'all just might die.
I had to wait for the
before anything happened.
I had to wait for that oil line. You know, I was sitting in the truck and he was there and he was talking about racing with Bobby Ellison and all. And I know those names when I was a little kid. I was flipping through all those American magazines about drag racing and Mickey Thompson and all that stuff. So I knew those names that he was referring to. And it is a very, very intelligent man who lives in the middle of Alabama, and he knows a lot about international affairs and stuff and how life works. And that's, for me, that was also a very, very valuable talk. So yeah, it's fantastic. Like you said, it's a huge high for me. And it was a big anticipation because it was very difficult for me to get here. So you anticipate it and you're like, and it exceeded expectations. I think you've done a fantastic job with this.
Thanks.
It's probably the best like drifting related stuff I've ever done in my life. It's a real eye-opener to me. And it's the best advertisement for America and for Americans and for American drifting that you could get. Like this is very, very, very well done. So.
Awesome. Well, on that note, get your ass back to Amsterdam.
Damn it.
Get out of Texas and Florida and all these amazing states. Go back to your normal life.
First.
Go back to your normal life. That's that. Thank you so much.
I'll miss you guys.
We'll miss you. I'm gonna come over to Amsterdam one day.
Everybody, all drifters are very welcome there.
Cool.
So.
I'm just like, can I sleep on your couch?
Yeah, you can.
Awesome. Okay, let's get out of here.
Oh man, my foot is sleeping. But you did a fantastic job, man.
Special thanks to BC Racing Coilovers. Without them, these videos and Drift Week and all that stuff couldn't have existed, so thank you so much to them. Huge shout out. They support grassroots racing. They support professional stuff. They won Formula D last year. They support Chelsea. All of our friends, Von Ginn Jr., all kinds of awesome people run their stuff. And also, they support Lone Star Drift and all my drivers. So thank you so much. And then also thank you to ECU Master USA. Huge shout out to them. Texas-based company. They're a USA portion of ECU Master, which is a worldwide brand. So thank you to them so much, to Zach, to ECU Master for supporting this event, and everybody else. We're so exhausted. Thank you for letting us do this. I can't believe we got to go so long on this. And thank you to Y-Plate Imports. Go over to their website, check out their inventory, which is an inside joke with Trenton because he's been on the trip the entire time, the owner, because he came with us and he probably doesn't have any inventory there right now. But check out what they do. They build cars. Go say hi to them on social media. Go to Y-Plate Imports on Instagram and say, hi Trenton, thank you for Drift Week 2, and that's it. Back to the video.